The wedding was to take place on a mild Saturday in late May in the village of St. Mary Mead, where important events were never allowed to remain private for very long, and where the arrival of a hired florist, a new motor car, or a relative from London could occupy conversation for several days if nothing more dramatic presented itself. By 10 o'clock in the morning, the churchyard of St. Mary's had already taken on that festive air which belongs to English village weddings. When white ribbons flutter from the lich gate, elderly ladies inspect the flower arrangements with the seriousness of judges, and the younger guests pretend not to notice that everyone is noticing them. The roses climbing the old stone wall had opened early that year, and the scent of them, warm and sweet in the sun, seemed to soften even the gravestones, as though the dead themselves had been asked to behave pleasantly for the occasion. Miss Jane Marple had been invited, not as a close friend of the bride or groom, but because in St. Mary Mead such distinctions were often less important than they appeared. She had known the bride, Clara Winthrop, since Clara was a thin, solemn child who wore her hair in to severe plaits and cried whenever she was asked to recite poetry at parish gatherings. Miss Marple had also known, though rather less warmly, the groom's family, the Ashfords of Bellwether House, whose money had once been considerable and whose pride had survived long after the money had begun to thin. The marriage, everyone agreed, was a very suitable one. Clara Winthrop was pretty, sensible, and quietly well off through her late father's estate, while Edward Ashford was charming, fair-haired, and possessed of that easy manner which made older women call him attentive and younger women call him impossible to resist. He had returned from London 6 months earlier, explaining that he had grown tired of city life and wished to restore Bellwether House to something like its former comfort. That explanation had been accepted by most people, though it had always seemed worth noticing that Edward spoke more often of restoration than of work. Bellwether House stood half a mile beyond the church, at the end of a lane shaded by chestnut trees, and it was there that the wedding breakfast was to be held. Its lawns had been trimmed, its terrace scrubbed, and its long drawing-room opened to the garden, where small tables had been arranged beneath a cream-coloured marquee. Everything looked graceful, old-fashioned, and just slightly strained, in the way of houses that have polished their silver for company while keeping certain doors firmly shut. Clara arrived at the church a little before 11, in a gown of ivory satin that had belonged to her mother, altered with lace at the sleeves and a narrow pearl clasp at the throat. She looked composed, though those who knew her well might have noticed that her composure had a fixed quality, as if she had decided in advance how happiness ought to appear and meant to keep to it at all costs. In her gloved hand she held a bouquet of white roses and lily-of-the-valley, tied with pale blue ribbon, and when she stepped from the motor car, she glanced once toward the far side of the churchyard, where a woman in a grey travelling coat stood partly behind the yew tree. It was the briefest glance, and no one remarked upon it at the time, except Miss Marple, who had a habit of seeing what other people dismissed as nothing. The woman in grey was not a villager, nor did she seem to belong among the guests, although she carried herself with the stiff patience of someone who had every right to be there and yet had not been welcomed. Her face was partly shaded by the brim of her hat, but her hands were visible, and they were clasped too tightly around a small black handbag. Edward Ashford was waiting at the church door with his best man, Rupert Vale, a polished young man with a thin moustache and the restless eyes of someone accustomed to calculating the value of every room he entered. Rupert laughed too loudly when Edward murmured something to him, then stopped laughing when he noticed Clara's arrival. It was not fear, exactly, that crossed his face, but recognition. And recognition can be a more dangerous thing than fear when it comes too suddenly. The ceremony itself was conducted without mishap. The vicar, who had married most of the village and buried the rest, spoke with feeling about patience, fidelity, and the joining of two lives, while Edward repeated his vows in a clear, confident voice. Clara's voice was softer, but steady enough, and when Edward placed the ring upon her finger, several ladies in the pew behind Miss Marple dabbed their eyes. Miss Marple did not dab hers. She was looking at the ring. It was a handsome ring, a little too handsome for Edward's present circumstances. Set with a small diamond between two sapphires, and when it caught the light, Clara's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly. It might have been emotion, of course. Weddings are full of emotion, and people are very fond of explaining small gestures by large words. But Miss Marple had seen young brides look at wedding rings before, and Clara's look was not wonder, nor delight. It was closer to confirmation. At the reception, the guests moved from sunlight to shade, from champagne to lemonade, from congratulations to speculation, while the village performed the delicate social dance in which everyone pretends to be interested only in the happiness of the couple and not at all in family histories, wills, old disappointments, or the cost of the food. Mrs. Bantry stood near the terrace steps discussing the flowers. Colonel Melchett praised the weather as though he had arranged it personally, and Miss Marple settled herself at a small table from which she could see the garden path, the drawing-room doors, and the bride's face whenever Clara turned toward the house. The first odd moment came during the speeches. Sir Henry Ashford, Edward's uncle and the formal owner of Belwether House, rose slowly from his chair, leaning on a silver-topped cane. He was a dry, narrow old man whose kindness, if he possessed any, had long ago retreated behind habit and suspicion. He welcomed Clara into the family with correct phrases and a mouth that barely moved. But midway through his speech, his gaze drifted to the woman in grey, who had somehow entered the garden and was standing at the edge of the marquee. For 1 second, his expression changed completely. It was not surprise. It was not displeasure. It was the look of a man who sees a bill presented for something he had believed forgotten. Then Edward stepped forward, smiling, and touched his uncle lightly on the sleeve. Sir Henry resumed his speech, the guests resumed their polite attention, and the woman in grey lowered her eyes as though she had expected no better. Only Clara, standing beside her husband, looked from Sir Henry to Edward and then to the ring on her finger. A little later, during the cutting of the cake, Clara's younger cousin, Beatrice Winthrop, made a careless remark about the pearls at Clara's throat. She said they were lovely, and asked whether they were the Ashford pearls, the famous ones that had once been worn at court. The question caused a small ripple, because everyone in the county knew that the Ashford pearls had vanished years before, though no one mentioned theft in polite company unless servants were involved. Edward laughed and said the clasp was only an old family trinket, hardly worth discussing, while Clara touched the pearls at her throat and smiled with the dutiful calm of a bride whose happiness is being photographed. But Miss Marple noticed that Rupert Vale looked not at the pearls but at Edward's hands, and that Edward, who had been holding the cake knife, set it down with unusual care. There were other details, all ordinary in themselves. A glass of elderflower cordial was placed on the small table beside Clara and then removed before she drank it. Sir Henry asked twice whether the library door had been locked. Edward's mother, Lady Ashford, pale and graceful and vague, seemed startled whenever anyone mentioned London. The woman in grey remained near the garden wall, refusing food, refusing champagne, refusing even the shade, as though she had come not to celebrate but to witness. And through it all, Clara moved from guest to guest with controlled sweetness, accepting kisses, blessings, jokes and advice while her eyes returned again and again to the house, especially to the west wing, where the shutters remained closed despite the warmth of the day. At 2:30, the photographer began arranging the wedding party on the lawn. It was then that the woman in grey came forward at last and spoke to Clara. No one heard the first words clearly, because the photographer was calling for Edward to stand nearer his bride, and Colonel Melchett had just dropped his hat. But Miss Marple, seated close enough to observe the angle of Clara's shoulders, saw the bride grow very still. The woman in grey opened her handbag and took out a folded piece of paper. Clara did not take it. Edward saw them then, crossed the lawn quickly, and greeted the woman with a warmth that was almost convincing. He called her Mrs. Lydgate, said how good it was of her to come, and suggested in a lower voice that she must be tired after her journey. The woman looked at him for a moment before replying. Then she said quite clearly that she had not come far enough to be tired. Several people laughed, thinking it a joke. Miss Marple did not laugh, because by then the truth had already entered the garden, carrying a black handbag, wearing a grey coat to warm for the weather, and standing just outside the circle of celebration where everyone could see her, and almost no one thought to ask why she had come. The tragedy, when it came, did not arrive with thunder, screams, or the sort of theatrical disturbance people later pretend they expected all along. It came instead with a misplaced silence, a pause in the rhythm of a summer afternoon, and because the day had been so carefully arranged for happiness. That silence seemed at first like nothing more than a servant being late or an elderly guest losing patience with the heat. After the photographs, the wedding party drifted back toward the marquee, where tea had been set out with sandwiches, fruit tarts, and a silver urn that hissed softly at the end of the long table. Clara had gone upstairs to change into a pale blue travelling dress, while Edward remained in the garden, receiving congratulations with the easy gratitude of a man who enjoyed being watched. Sir Henry had disappeared into the house shortly after the photographer finished, saying something about fatigue, though he had looked less tired than unsettled when he passed through the French doors. Mrs. Lydgate, the woman in grey, was still near the garden wall. No one had properly introduced her. This was noticed, but not discussed, because in English villages there are many things considered rude to ask directly and irresistible to discuss later. She had spoken briefly with Clara, more briefly with Edward, and not at all with Lady Ashford, who had turned away so abruptly on seeing her that Mrs. Bantry, who never missed a social tremor, had paused midway through buttering a scone. Miss Marple observed all this from her chair beneath the edge of the marquee, knitting a small pale garment that no one had asked about, and listening with an attention that seemed directed entirely at wool. She heard Beatrice Winthrop telling Rupert Vale that Clara looked strange rather than happy, and Rupert answering that brides often did. She heard Edward ask a footman whether the motor car had been brought round, then immediately correct himself and say there was no hurry. She heard Lady Ashford ask twice whether Sir Henry had taken his tonic. The word tonic was repeated often enough to become part of the afternoon's furniture. Sir Henry, it seemed, took a prescribed tonic every day after luncheon. A bitter preparation, kept in a small brown bottle in the library cabinet, because he disliked having medicine laid openly before guests. Lady Ashford mentioned this in her airy way, apologizing for her brother-in-law's habits as though illness were a social inconvenience. Edward said the old man was perfectly capable of dosing himself, while Rupert joked that Sir Henry would outlive them, all merely to spite anyone waiting for an inheritance. It was an unfortunate joke, and because it was unfortunate, several people laughed too quickly. At 3:20, a maid came to the terrace and looked about with a frightened expression. Her name was Alice Pike, a local girl whose mother took in washing, and she had the pale, pinched face of someone accustomed to being blamed before she was heard. She whispered to the butler, who went into the house at once. Edward noticed excused himself, and followed. A moment later, Lady Ashford rose with a hand at her throat, while Colonel Melchett, sensing official usefulness even before disaster had been announced, set down his cup. The announcement itself came from the butler, delivered in the stiff voice of a man trying not to tremble. Sir Henry had been found unconscious in the library. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The garden seemed to hold itself in position, with the ribbons still fluttering, the cups still balanced on saucers, the scent of roses still drifting across the lawn as if nothing human had any power to alter the day. Then everyone began speaking at once. Lady Ashford gave a small cry and allowed Mrs. Bantry to support her. Edward ran into the house. Rupert followed him. Clara, who had just appeared at the top of the terrace steps in her blue travelling dress, stopped so suddenly that her hand tightened around the banister. Miss Marple looked at Clara's hand before she looked toward the library. That was not because she lacked feeling, but because feeling often announces itself most honestly in the body before words have time to arrange themselves. Clara's face showed shock, as anyone's might have done. Her hand, however, did not reach for Edward, nor for Lady Ashford, nor even for the pearls at her throat. It went instead to the pocket of her travelling dress, where the folded paper from Mrs. Lydgate had finally been placed. The doctor arrived within 15 minutes, having been among the invited guests and having wisely refrained from champagne. By then, Sir Henry had been moved only enough for examination, and the library had been cleared of all but Edward, Lady Ashford, Colonel Melchett, the butler. And Dr. Haydock. Miss Marple did not enter. She remained in the hall, where she could see the library door standing open and the little table beside Sir Henry's chair, on which rested a glass, a spoon, and the brown tonic bottle. Alice Pike, the maid, stood near the staircase, crying silently into her apron. She had found him, she said, when she went to draw the curtains in the library, though this was odd because it was a bright afternoon and the curtains had not needed drawing. When asked why she had gone in at all, she said Mr. Edward had told her earlier that Sir Henry disliked glare on the west windows. Edward, hearing this, turned sharply and said he had merely suggested that someone might see to the room if Sir Henry meant to rest there. It was a small difference. People noticed the sharpness more than the words. Dr. Haydock's face, when he emerged, was grave enough to quiet the entire hall. Sir Henry was dead. The cause could not yet be formally stated, though the doctor believed poisoning was possible, perhaps through the tonic. Colonel Melchett at once took charge, and the wedding became, with shocking speed, a case. What followed was exactly the sort of confusion that makes truth difficult. Not because truth has vanished, but because everyone begins dragging it in a direction useful to themselves. Lady Ashford insisted Sir Henry had enemies in business, though no one believed he had conducted any real business in years. Rupert suggested the old man may have mixed his medicines carelessly. Beatrice whispered that perhaps the mysterious Mrs. Lydgate had come for revenge. Edward said very little, which some found dignified and others found calculated. Clara said nothing at all. She stood by the drawing-room window, pale and composed, while the guests were gently prevented from leaving. When Edward approached her and touched her elbow, she moved half an inch away. So slight a movement that only someone accustomed to watching unhappy marriages at their beginning would have seen it. Miss Marple saw it. She also saw Mrs. Lydgate in the hall, sitting upright on a narrow chair, still holding the black handbag in her lap, no longer looking like an intruder, but like a person who had expected misfortune and was waiting to see which name it would choose. The first suspicion naturally fell upon convenience. Sir Henry's death benefited Edward, since Belwether House and what remained of the Ashford estate would pass to him. It also benefited Clara, now married into that inheritance. It might even have benefited Lady Ashford, whose anxious dependence on her brother-in-law had been plain to anyone with eyes. And because Mrs. Lydgate had appeared uninvited, carried a secret paper, and had once known the family in some undefined London connection, she quickly became the most satisfying object of curiosity. But satisfying is not the same as true. The tonic bottle had been in the library cabinet all afternoon, or so everyone believed. Sir Henry alone drank from it, and the servants knew better than to touch it. The glass beside his chair smelled faintly bitter, though whether more bitter than usual no one could say. The library door had been locked earlier, or perhaps only closed, depending on whom one asked. Edward had been seen near the terrace. Rupert had entered the house briefly after the cake cutting. Lady Ashford had sent Alice for hot water. Clara had been upstairs. Mrs. Lydgate had never left the garden, at least according to those who had been watching her, because she was easier to suspect than the people they loved. By late afternoon, the wedding flowers had begun to wilt. The bride's bouquet lay forgotten on a side table in the drawing-room, its blue ribbon damp where someone had spilled lemonade nearby. Miss Marple noticed that one white rose had been crushed at the stem, not broken in the ordinary way flowers suffer from handling, but pressed as though caught for a moment in a closing drawer or beneath something heavy. It was not, by itself, an important detail. Most important details are not important by themselves. Then Clara crossed the room, picked up the bouquet, and removed that single damaged rose before anyone could remark on it. She did it calmly, almost absently, and placed the flower into the fireplace, where no fire had been lit because of the weather. Edward was speaking to Colonel Melchett at the time and did not see her. Mrs. Lydgate did. Miss Marple did. And Clara, for the first time that day, looked frightened not of death, not of scandal, but of being understood too soon. A investigação ainda vai caminhar por detalhes pequenos, gestos discretos e escolhas aparentemente comuns. Então, se você gosta desse tipo de mistério em que a solução nasce do que sempre esteve diante dos olhos, inscrever-se no canal ajuda a acompanhar as próximas histórias com esse mesmo cuidado narrativo. By early evening, Belwether House no longer resembled the setting of a wedding. The flowers were still in place, the musicians had quietly packed away their instruments, and the long tables remained covered with untouched desserts, yet every object now seemed to belong to another occasion. One interrupted so completely that it was difficult to remember how cheerful the afternoon had appeared only a few hours earlier. Colonel Melchett requested that the principal guests remain at the house until the local police inspector arrived from Much Benham. No one objected. In truth, very few people wished to leave. Curiosity has always been one of the strongest forces in St. Mary Mead, and even those who sincerely grieved for Sir Henry found themselves watching the movements of everyone else with unusual care. The inspector reached Belwether House shortly before 6 o'clock. He was practical, courteous, and sensible enough to understand that the first explanations offered in country house tragedies were almost never the correct ones. He spoke first with Dr. Haydock, then examined the library before asking to interview each person individually. Miss Marple was not questioned immediately. She preferred it that way. She spent the waiting time quietly walking through the garden with Mrs. Bantry, who talked almost continuously. Not because she knew anything useful, but because silence made her uncomfortable. "I cannot understand why Clara looks so composed," Mrs. Bantry whispered. People who are trying very hard not to think often appear calmer than those who are. Miss Marple replied gently. Mrs. Bantry nodded, though she was clearly more interested in Mrs. Lydgate, and that woman. "No one seems willing to explain who she really is." "No," said Miss Marple. That is much more interesting than explaining who she is. Mrs. Bantry looked puzzled. Miss Marple did not elaborate. Inside the house. The inspector's interviews began, producing facts that appeared important but refused to fit comfortably together. Edward explained that Sir Henry had complained for several weeks about indigestion and weakness. The tonic, he said, had been prescribed by Dr. Haydock months earlier and was kept in the library simply because. Sir Henry disliked interruptions during the afternoon. Rupert Vale confirmed this but added something rather curious. He mentioned that Sir Henry had recently become suspicious that someone was entering the library without permission. Did he say why? Asked the inspector. Rupert hesitated. He believed papers had been moved. Were they? I never noticed. Did he? He believed so. Believed, another useful word. Lady Ashford's interview was less informative. She remembered very little in precise order. Confused times, confused conversations, and insisted repeatedly that her brother-in-law had become increasingly anxious during the previous fortnight. What troubled him? I'm not sure. You must have some idea, he said. He said old mistakes sometimes return. What mistakes? I never asked. The inspector wrote that down without comment. Meanwhile, Clara waited alone in the morning room. When her turn came, she answered every question politely. Yes, she had spoken with Mrs. Lydgate. Yes, Mrs. Lydgate had given her a folded letter. No, she had not yet shown it to anyone. May I see it? Asked the inspector. Without protest, Clara handed it over. The letter contained only a single page. No accusations, no threats, no demands for money. Instead, it asked Clara to meet privately after the ceremony because there was something concerning the Ashford family that she deserved to know before beginning married life. The inspector looked disappointed. It was exactly the sort of letter that created suspicion while proving almost nothing. What was Mrs. Lydgate referring to? I don't know. You didn't ask. I intended to, but you never did. No, why not? Clara lowered her eyes. Everything happened too quickly. That answer was perfectly reasonable. Miss Marple, hearing about it later, thought it perfectly incomplete. The inspector then interviewed Mrs. Lydgate herself. Unlike the others, she answered directly. She had once worked as secretary to Sir Henry's late business partner in London nearly 25 years earlier. She had known the Ashford family during that period. She had recently discovered information she believed Clara should know before committing herself permanently to the marriage. What information? I'm afraid I would rather explain that after speaking with Miss Winthrop herself, I'm afraid that is no longer your decision. Mrs. Lydgate looked steadily at him. It concerns reputation. Whose? She paused. The family's. Does it concern Sir Henry? In part. Edward Ashford. Another pause. Also in part. The inspector leaned forward. Does it concern today's death? No? Are you certain? Quite certain. That answer, strangely enough, impressed Miss Marple more than anything else she had heard. A guilty person usually tries to distance themselves from danger. An innocent person distances the danger from the truth. Those are not the same thing. Later that evening, while most of the guests remained gathered in uneasy conversation, Miss Marple quietly asked Alice Pike whether she would walk with her to the kitchen garden. The maid agreed, though she seemed frightened. You found Sir Henry? Miss Marple asked. Yes, miss. Were you alone? Yes. You looked at once toward the medicine table? Alice blinked. How did you know? Because everyone else has spoken first about Sir Henry. You have spoken first about the bottle. Alice seemed genuinely surprised. I suppose I did, Miss Marple smiled kindly. That is often how memory behaves. The girl hesitated before speaking again. I noticed something odd. What was it? The spoon. What about it? It wasn't where Sir Henry usually left it. You've seen him take the tonic before. Nearly every day, and today, it looked cleaned. Yes, miss. How unusual, I thought so. Miss Marple thanked her and changed the subject entirely, asking about Alice's mother and the vegetable garden as though the conversation had never mattered. But it had, because poison may explain a death. A cleaned spoon suggests someone was thinking about what others might notice afterward. Those are two very different ideas. As dusk settled over Belwether House, Miss Marple wandered alone into the library for the first time. Nothing dramatic remained. The body had already been removed. The glass was gone. The tonic bottle had been taken for examination. Only ordinary objects filled the room now. Books, writing desk, fireplace, portraits, and the west-facing window. She stood there quietly. Then she noticed something that everyone else had overlooked because it was too ordinary to attract attention. The dust on the inside latch had been disturbed recently. Not wiped away, simply interrupted. Someone had opened that window during the afternoon. That would have meant very little, except that every witness had insisted the library door and not the window was the only possible way in or out. Miss Marple gently touched the latch with one fingertip. Then she smiled almost sadly. The truth, she murmured to herself, has never been hiding. It has merely been waiting for everyone to stop looking in the wrong direction. The following morning brought clear skies, singing blackbirds, and the peculiar calm that often follows violent disruption. Belwether House looked almost unchanged from the outside. The white marquee still stood on the lawn, the wedding flowers remained in their vases, and the gravelled drive bore the tracks of yesterday's arriving guests. Only the silence was different. It was no longer the comfortable silence of the English countryside, but the restrained quiet of a household waiting for uncomfortable questions. The inspector returned shortly after breakfast with the preliminary findings from the county laboratory. There was indeed poison in Sir Henry's tonic. The quantity had been sufficient to cause death within minutes of ingestion. What the report could not establish, however, was precisely when the poison had been introduced into the bottle. That uncertainty changed everything. If the tonic had been poisoned before the wedding guests arrived, then almost anyone with earlier access to the house could be responsible. If it had been introduced during the reception, then the list narrowed considerably. Everyone immediately began arranging the facts according to whichever theory best suited the person they least trusted. Miss Marple did precisely the opposite. She began arranging people according to habits. That, she often believed, was considerably more reliable. She asked permission to walk through the house once more, not as an investigator, but as an elderly guest trying to occupy herself while official business continued. The inspector, already aware that ignoring Miss Marple had rarely improved an investigation, readily agreed. She first entered the library. Nothing appeared especially different from the previous evening. Yet now she noticed something that had escaped even her careful observation before. Sir Henry's writing desk was perfectly orderly, almost too orderly. A man genuinely anxious about missing documents does not usually leave every drawer aligned, every pen squared with mathematical precision, and every sheet of paper stacked neatly after entertaining dozens of wedding guests in his home. Someone had organized the desk recently. Not because Sir Henry preferred order, but because disorder had existed first, that thought remained quietly in her mind. She then visited the west corridor leading toward the shuttered wing of Bellwether House. Shutters had finally been opened. Dust floated through the morning light, revealing rooms that had once been elegant but had gradually fallen into neglect. Portraits covered with linen sheets lined the walls, while old furniture stood beneath white cloths like forgotten monuments. Near one unused sitting room, Miss Marple noticed fresh marks on the wooden floor, not footprints. The narrow scratches left by something heavy being dragged a short distance. The marks ended beside a small side table. Nothing remarkable rested upon it, only an empty porcelain vase. She bent slightly to examine the floor. One scratch continued beneath the table itself. Someone had moved it recently, not servants. Servants tend to return furniture exactly where it belongs. This had been replaced imperfectly, a tiny observation. Yet tiny observations often survive where larger ones disappear. Meanwhile, the inspector questioned Mrs. Lydgate again. This time she disclosed the reason for her unexpected arrival. Many years earlier, while working in London, she had handled correspondence concerning a substantial investment managed jointly by Sir Henry and another businessman. That businessman had died unexpectedly. Officially, the investment failed. Unofficially, certain sums of money could never be fully accounted for. "I don't believe Sir Henry murdered anyone," she said calmly, "but I do believe he concealed the truth, and Edward?" asked the inspector. Mrs. Lydgate looked thoughtful. "I believe Edward knows less than people assume." That answer surprised everyone. It even surprised Miss Marple. Because until then, Edward had appeared to be the obvious beneficiary. Yet obvious beneficiaries frequently become convenient distractions. While these conversations unfolded downstairs, Clara remained in the small morning room overlooking the rose garden. Miss Marple joined her quietly. For several moments neither woman spoke. Finally Clara broke the silence. "Everyone thinks yesterday began with happiness." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Most people prefer beginnings that make sense after endings. I nearly called off the wedding, I know." Clara looked up sharply. "You know?" "You looked several times toward Mrs. Lydgate before entering the church." Clara lowered her eyes. "I hoped she wouldn't come, but part of you expected her." "Yes." Miss Marple folded her hands. "You had doubts. I had questions. There is usually very little difference." Clara hesitated before continuing. "Mrs. Lydgate wrote to me a week ago. You had another letter?" "Yes, I burned it." "And what did it say?" "Only that I should ask Edward one question before marrying him. Did you?" "How?" "Why not?" Clara gave a sad smile. "I was afraid of the answer." Miss Marple nodded. That, too, was perfectly human. People often imagine that ignorance protects happiness. Experience suggests otherwise. Before leaving, Miss Marple asked only one more question. "When Mrs. Lydgate handed you the folded paper yesterday, why did you finally place it in your pocket instead of reading it?" Clara answered almost immediately. "Because Edward was watching." That answer lingered with Miss Marple long after the conversation ended, not because of what it proved, because of what it implied. Later that afternoon, the inspector received another report. Fingerprints recovered from the tonic bottle belonged exactly to those expected: Sir Henry, his valet, the butler. No unidentified prints. The result disappointed everyone except Miss Marple. She had never expected fingerprints to solve anything. People may wipe bottles. They rarely wipe memories. As evening approached, she returned once more to the west window of the library. Standing outside this time, She looked carefully across the garden. The angle immediately caught her attention. From that window, one could see the exact place where Mrs. Lydgate had stood for most of the wedding reception. Not only see her, watch her continuously, which meant someone inside the library had also been watching, not hiding from her, waiting for her. Miss Marple slowly turned back toward the house. The pieces were no longer scattered. They had begun forming a picture. There remained one important misunderstanding shared by nearly everyone involved. The household believed Sir Henry's death was the central event. It was not. The true story had begun many years earlier. Yesterday's death was merely the moment when an old secret, carefully preserved through silence, finally became impossible to control. And whoever had poisoned the tonic had not acted because of the wedding itself. They had acted because they believed Mrs. Lydgate's arrival meant that, before sunset, the truth would finally be spoken aloud. The gathering took place the next afternoon in the drawing room of Bellwether House, where the wedding breakfast had been intended to end with laughter instead of solemnity. The flowers had begun to fade, their white petals curling slightly at the edges, and the great windows stood open to the gardens, allowing the gentle sounds of St. Mary Mead to drift inside. Somewhere beyond the lawns, a church bell marked the hour with complete indifference to the anxieties of those assembled beneath the Ashford roof. Colonel Melchett the inspectors, Dr. Hay Duwood, Clara, Rupert Vale, Mrs. Lydgate, Mrs. Bantry, and a handful of other principal witnesses were present. No one seemed eager to speak. Miss Marple remained seated quietly near the fireplace until the inspector invited her to explain the observations she had mentioned earlier that morning. She folded her hands neatly in her lap before beginning. "I believe," she said gently, "that everyone has been trying to solve the wrong mystery." Several faces turned toward her. "We have all been asking who poisoned Sir Henry. That is certainly an important question. But another question should have been asked first." She paused. "Why did someone choose that particular afternoon?" No one answered, because the timing was not accidental. The wedding did not create the motive. It merely created a deadline. Mrs. Lydgate lowered her eyes. "You came here," Miss Marple continued, looking toward her, "because you intended to tell Clara something before she began her married life." Mrs. Lydgate nodded. "I did. It concerned events that took place many years ago, yes, but those events were not about missing money." A slight expression of surprise crossed the woman's face. "They were about identity." Silence filled the room. Miss Marple turned toward Lady Ashford. "Your late husband and Sir Henry protected a secret for decades." Lady Ashford closed her eyes. Edward stared at his mother. "What secret?" She did not answer. Miss Marple spoke softly. "Edward, Sir Henry was not your uncle." Edward frowned. "What? He was your father." The room remained perfectly still. Lady Ashford covered her face. Mrs. Lydgate quietly began to cry. Years earlier, before Lady Ashford's marriage had completely collapsed, she had entered into a relationship with Sir Henry. When Edward was born, the scandal would have destroyed both branches of the family. The child had therefore been raised as the son of Lady Ashford's husband. Only for people had known the truth. Lady Ashford, Sir Henry, Mrs. Lydgate, and the solicitor who prepared several confidential family documents before his death, Mrs. Lydgate, had discovered copies of those documents while settling the solicitor's estate months earlier. She had come to warn Clara because she believed she deserved to know the truth before marrying into a family built upon deception. Edward sank slowly into his chair. "My entire life was arranged to protect appearances," Miss Marple finished kindly. "But appearances are rarely satisfied forever." The inspector leaned forward. But none of that explains the poisoning. No, Miss Marple agreed. It explains only why yesterday became dangerous. She turned toward Rupert Vale. You knew. Rupert's face changed almost imperceptibly. I beg your pardon. You already knew Edward's true parentage. Nonsense, you discovered it while helping. Sir Henry organized his legal papers several weeks ago. Rupert said nothing. You also discovered something else. Miss Marple looked toward the inspector. Sir Henry had decided to alter his will. The inspector immediately understood. The estate was no longer to be divided as Rupert expected. Rupert had spent years assuming that. Edward's uncertain financial position made him dependent upon his friendship and advice. More importantly, Rupert had secretly accumulated considerable gambling debts. He believed that once Sir Henry died, Edward would inherit everything exactly as expected, and Rupert would finally persuade his lifelong friend to rescue him financially. Instead, while organizing old legal papers, Rupert discovered the confidential documents concerning Edward's true birth and Sir Henry's intention to rewrite his will. The revised will would establish a trust protecting Bellwether House and most of the estate. Edward would inherit far less than Rupert had anticipated. Even worse, Mrs. Lydgate's arrival threatened to expose the family secret before the changes could quietly be completed. Rupert realized that once the truth emerged, Sir Henry would almost certainly finalize the new arrangements immediately. His opportunity would disappear forever. So you poisoned the tonic, said the inspector. Rupert remained silent. But not during the reception, Miss Marple added. No, everyone looked toward her. The poison had already been placed in the bottle before the ceremony. The inspector frowned. But witnesses have been concentrating on the wrong object. Miss Marple smiled gently. The bottle was never altered yesterday. The spoon was. She looked toward Alice Pike, standing quietly near the doorway. You noticed it before anyone else. Alice nodded timidly. The spoon had been washed. Exactly. Rupert had prepared the poisoned tonic in advance, expecting Sir Henry to drink it privately after luncheon, as he always did. After Sir Henry collapsed, Rupert realized tiny traces might remain on the measuring spoon. While everyone rushed toward the library, he quietly cleaned it and returned it to the table, an insignificant action. Unless one remembered Alice's observation. But what about the library window? Asked Colonel Melchett. That was never an escape route, Miss Marple replied. It was simply where Sir Henry had been watching Mrs. Lydgate. He saw her arrive. He understood immediately why she had come. He knew the past had finally reached Bellwether House. Rupert also understood. And once he realized, Sir Henry knew the truth was about to emerge. He abandoned every remaining hope of avoiding suspicion. He merely hoped suspicion would fall elsewhere. On the mysterious visitor, on Clara, on Edward, on anyone except himself. The inspector slowly turned toward Rupert. You cleaned the spoon because you believed investigators would examine the bottle. Rupert laughed once, a tired laugh. It seemed sensible. No, Miss Marple answered quietly. It seemed hurried. For the first time since the investigation began, Rupert's confidence disappeared completely. He looked at Edward. I never meant... Edward interrupted him. You never meant to be caught. Rupert lowered his head. After several moments, he quietly confessed, not dramatically, not emotionally, simply because every explanation remaining had already been removed. When the inspector finally led him away, no one moved. Bellwether House had become strangely peaceful. The mystery had not depended upon hidden evidence. It had depended upon overlooked meaning. Mrs. Lydgate approached Clara and handed her the original documents. "You should have these." Clara accepted them without opening the envelope. She looked toward Edward. "I don't know what tomorrow will look like," Edward answered honestly. "Neither do I." It was the first completely honest sentence anyone had spoken since the wedding began. Miss Marple watched them from the window. Mrs. Bantry joined her. "You knew very early, didn't you?" Miss Marple smiled. "Oh no, I simply noticed that everyone kept looking for new facts, and there weren't any. There almost never are." She glanced across the quiet garden, where the white ribbons still fluttered beneath the afternoon breeze. The truth usually arrives before the mystery. It simply waits for someone to understand what they have been looking at all along. Outside, St. Mary Mead slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm. The wedding had ended. The morning had begun. The deception had finally ended. And the quiet English village, which so often seemed incapable of keeping secrets, had once again proved that its greatest mysteries were never hidden by darkness, only by perfectly ordinary people choosing, for many years, to look in another direction.